All right, my name is Jessica Skidmore, and I'm the Secretary for Environmental Law Society here at Florida Coastal. I'm happy to introduce our next panelists. We have Robert C. Volpe. He is an associate with the law firm of Hopping, Green & Sands, PA in Tallahassee. Robert's practice includes environmental regulatory matters, environmental litigation, and land use regulation. In addition to his current practice, Robert has extensive experience in real estate valuation matters. Robert has been published in the area of nuclear energy regulatory policy and earned both his JD and BS from Florida State University.
All right, good afternoon. Today we're going to be talking, I will be talking about land use controls as a mechanism for sustainability. And I'll be going before TR, and we'll piece these together, and then we can talk about property security and offer some questions hopefully you guys will have about sustainability. So I geared my presentation for both a student audience and a professional audience. Hopefully that we can both find something useful in this and get something out of this. But I want to start off with the history, with an idea about sustainability. So what does sustainability mean? Looking forward, how do we plan now for what future generations will use and what we will leave behind? I love corny little quotes like this. So, the future generation is the most important. I believe Confucius said that, but he says a lot of things. Treat the earth well. It was not given to you by your parents, it was loaned to you by your children. And that's how we should think about sustainability. So what is sustainable development? Sustainable development is creating a world where we can balance growth and the future, growth and how we will leave it beyond us. Our technique for sustainability is land use controls, zoning, land use regulation. There's some higher level, but I want to start off with the history of zoning. Why zoning? Why do we use zoning? Well, basically zoning promotes the public health, safety, and welfare of communities. That is based in our constitutional police power. Prior to zoning, everything was common law nuisance, common law, I guess you could also have negligence, but mainly public and private nuisance. It was reactive. The idea was you build something next to my property and I don't like it, then I sue you and let the courts decide whether or not that was an appropriate use. And some great historical cases of this. Francis v. Skolkoff, I'm not pronouncing that correctly. Essentially, you had a rental, apartment complex directly next door to a tanning operation. And I've never seen a tanning operation, but I hear they have to boil animal hides, and I'm sure you can imagine what that smells like. But the court said that that was a nuisance, and there was a recovery for damages. So that's kind of the start of your property is causing a nuisance on my property. Then we get into the idea of injunctive relief. So in Mink v. Hopman, this is just another case of a nuisance where there was a residential use directly next door to a slaughterhouse. I'm not sure why all these cases have to do with animals. Maybe that was the time. But I'm going to fast forward through a few of these, but the idea is these cases were all retroactive. Public nuisance, private nuisance, you built something and now it's causing me a problem and we'll go to the courts to figure it out. Sometime around the Industrial Revolution, when basically what was causing all of this was when municipalities came up with the idea of zoning, and that brings us into Euclid, which is our seminal case in zoning. Prior to Euclid, you had a few cases where municipalities passed laws limiting private property uses, and the compensation scheme was essentially a taking for loss of value. So some examples of that are Mugler and Hadacek. But both of those cases were the idea that the municipality passed a regulation, limited the use of a private property, and the remedy for that was a damage for a lost use, or similar to a takings. But Euclid, we'll fast forward past that. Euclid was one of the first cases that established our modern zoning. The city of Euclid passed a land use plan, essentially, that defined how Amber Realty Company could use their property. And based on that land use plan, Amber Realty Company had a large loss in property value. And as any of us would, there was a lawsuit involved, and the court decided that the city of Euclid was in the right and that they could limit the uses of Amber Realty's land. That set up the prospective idea of zoning rather than the retrospective will sue for nuisance. Now that we have the idea of what Euclid set up, it's based on planning for the health, safety, and welfare of the community. Municipalities have the police power granted from the state, and they can use that police power to plan for the overall general health, safety, and welfare, not just for individuals. Let's fast forward to now. In Florida, one of the newest ideas one of the newest developments in planning is the sector plan. This is a large-scale style type development. The origins of the sector plan program are in 1995. It started as a pilot program, which was kind of an addition to the Florida Growth Management Act. And the pilot program centered around 3 or 4 different developments, 3 or 4 different communities that were large in scale, 5,000 acres plus. And the idea behind the sector development plan is to plan for long-term planning for conservation, development, and agriculture on a landscape scale. In 2011, sector plan program was moved from a pilot program and added to the Florida Growth Management Act. There were a few additions to it. It was increased from 5,000 acres to 15,000 acre minimums. The 2011 program set in place a 2-tiered development plan where first there is a long-term vision for the entire sector, and then beyond that there are multiple detailed plans to implement the long-term master plan, and they have to be congruent with the long-term master plan. And the sector plan idea, I know many of you have probably heard of DRI's, developments of regional impact. The sector plan program was put in place to replace the larger scale DRIs and to maybe move past and move beyond the DRI program, which has been eroded and is I guess maybe twilighting in Florida. But sector plans set up a unique landscape scale development program. So I want to get into some specific case studies, some ideas. This is the North Ranch Master Plan. This is Deseret Land Company, Deseret Cattle and Ranches. They are, see that? Yes. They're basically most of the property east of Orlando, between Melbourne and Orlando. They're the largest cattle owner, I believe, east of Texas, and one of the largest landowners in the state of Florida. So in 2011, the Deseret proposed a sector plan for 133,000 acres called the North Ranch Master Plan. And included in the North Ranch Master Plan, it was projected for a 2080 development, so a long-term, large-scale development. Part of the sector planning program is that in the process, the developers have to look at future populations, at future transportation corridors, and they have to pair up between transportation, conservation, growth, and development. And part of the sector plan program requires that for resource protection and preservation, the DEP, the Department of Environmental Protection, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission, and the Department of Agriculture, as well as water management districts, they all have to evaluate the conservation plans and the set-aside areas. So essentially, sector plans take a large-scale community from the developer's hands saying, I'm going to develop just the development area and let the municipality worry about the infrastructure. This incorporates the infrastructure, the conservation, all the other ideas that were previously on the state and the municipalities, and incorporates those into a long-term development. So in the North Ranch Master Plan, Deseret set aside 42% of the 133,000 acres, roughly, I think it's 55,000 acres, for permanent preservation area. They set aside 15% for greenways, trails, parks, other sustainable type infrastructure. 5% is the Taylor Creek Reservoir, which is which was incorporated with the St. John River Water Management District. And the remaining 38% is in urban development and right-of-ways. So the development part is only 38% of the 133,000 acres. This is one of, I don't know exactly how many sector plans are currently active in Florida, but this is by far the largest. It's almost the largest development or master plan community in the history of the U.S. But you can see how Florida has gone from small-scale, local development and planning, and now is looking at these larger-scale, long-term development plans through the sector plan program. Also, in this plan, in the Deseret Master Plan, they incorporated a smart development portion for major transportation corridors that don't exist currently between Orlando and Melbourne. I know we're north of there, but I'm sure most of you have been down to Orlando in that area, and it is expanding. It's expanding faster than the infrastructure can keep up, and part of this sector plan was to get ahead of the infrastructure and to set aside the preservation areas before, with a long-term plan in mind. Some other ideas for sustainable development through land use planning. This is the Streamsong Resort. This, you can tell by the contours, this was formerly a mosaic phosphate mine. And through some creative land use planning, the abandoned phosphate mine, after it was completed, was turned into a resort and a natural preservation area. It incorporates a golf course, it incorporates a resort, but the majority of the land is natural preservation area, and the idea was to remediate back to natural Florida, to what the land was like before phosphate mining. That wasn't through the sector plan program, but it's another idea of how land use controls can be used to change from an industrial land use to a recreational reclaimed preservation area. Another idea for sustainable development is city infill. Cascades Park in Tallahassee, my office is right around the corner there. It was a drainage area, this entire park that runs from the pond on the north side and curves down to the southwest. It was a drainage area. It was also a former fuel station, fuel filling area. There was the Brownfields program was involved, but now it's hard to tell from this picture, but flowing down through that area, through the park, it dips down into the center, and actually serves as a drainage basin for the city of Tallahassee. And if there's a hard rain or a tropical storm or something like that, the park will fill up and then drain naturally rather than running off straight from the city into the lakes and river systems south of Tallahassee. So it's a way to serve as, there's an amphitheater, there's other amenities for the population, but it also serves as a sustainability component for the water resources around Tallahassee. The last idea, I'm really excited about these, are agri-hoods. It's essentially a neighborhood with a farm in the middle. I wish I'd had a bigger picture. This is Serenbe. It's a community outside of Atlanta, and they have an operating, working farm on the Serenbe property. There's a farmer's market. There's restaurants that use the food that is farmed on the property. And almost like a community, a CSA, a community agriculture program, the residents of Serenbe bought their houses bought their properties with the idea that they were pitching into the homeowners association that runs the farm. So it's a way to incorporate what used to be separated, residential and agriculture. We tried to get them as far away as you could, jump all the way back to the 1800s cases where when the farm was right next to your house, you would sue them for a nuisance. Now we're trying to bring the farms right back into the middle of the neighborhood, but doing it in a way that pleases both the residents and fulfills the idea of continuing sustainable agriculture. This is just another picture of a new agri-hood development that's planned for East Orlando off of Colonial Drive. And it's just another way to incorporate sustainability and development to balance the public health, safety, and welfare and sustainability in the long run. So that's it for my presentation, and I appreciate your time.
My PowerPoint going to come up?
All right. Our next speaker is Mr. T.R. Hainline, Jr. He is a shareholder in Rogers Towers Governmental and Regulatory Law Department. He practices in the areas of land use law, local government procurement, and governmental relations. His experience includes comprehensive planning, zoning, concurrency, local government procurement, impact fees, exactions, and related permitting matters for numerous developments, permitting for developments of regional impact, negotiation of development agreements for landowners and developers, land use litigation in state and federal courts, administrative hearings, consultation and preparation of bids and responses to requests for proposals for local government contracts, and procurement hearings. He holds an AB from Duke University and a JD from Duke University. Thank you.
Thank you. You know, I don't know why I'm prompted to say this, but so I've been in land use law for 33 years now. And why? Why would anyone go into land use law? Think about that. And just being here in a law school context reminds me that when I was in law school, I took this class called wildlife law, which I thought had to be cool. And indeed, it was very cool. And one of the cases that we studied and that I did a paper on involved the establishment of a migratory bird refuge. And of course, when they established it and did a lot of things to encourage birds to get there, a lot of birds came, and a guy had a piece of property next door where he farmed, and all the birds would come, and then they'd go over to his farm too and eat all of his crops. So he actually sued in kind of a takings claim and prevailed, and we studied that case, and I thought, well, that was just about the coolest thing I could think of this juxtaposition between the migratory bird refuge and this guy who was going to sue for takings because the birds were eating his crops. And that was part of why I got into land use law, because when I came to the firm, there wasn't, there was this and that I could do, but then we got into zoning and it had some of those same issues, and so, and some of what Robert was talking about. I'm going to talk about a different aspect. By the way, how do you advance the slide? Is there a keyboard? There we go, okay. Okay. So I'm going to talk about a different aspect of sustainable development. And it is related very much, though, to what Robert was talking about because, for example, he mentioned sector plans and he mentioned some of the land use controls aspects of sector plans. There are a couple of sector plans here in Northeast Florida. One is not very far from here in Northwest St. Johns County, and another one is up in kind of the east central part of Nassau County. And those are two examples, they're not many, here in Northeast Florida of sector plans. And what I'm about to talk to you about, I've worked on in both of those, and that is funding of infrastructure. So when you hear about growth management and sustainable development concepts, land use and land use controls are definitely one important aspect of that. But another very important aspect of that is funding infrastructure. What infrastructure will be there, whether it's roads, water and sewer, stormwater, police service, schools, any of that. Infrastructure and funding of infrastructure is a very important part of growth management and sustainable development, and that's what I'm going to talk some about here today, and including talking about those two sector plan examples that I mentioned. So I've titled this, Whence Comes the Money? Because at least when it comes to infrastructure, I assure you that as in many things in life, it's about who pays and what do they pay. And sadly, money is a real part of life, and it is definitely a part of life in trying to figure out how infrastructure gets built and who funds it. So let's see, just the enter part? Yes, indeed. So like I said, I'm going to talk about the funding of infrastructure and some of the ways to do that, and I'm going to focus on transportation infrastructure, because if you're involved in any land use issues, pretty much anywhere in Florida as well as around the country, transportation, traffic, transportation infrastructure is always kind of the most important thing. A lot of people yell about it, get frustrated about it, show up at zoning hearings about it, so you see a lot of that. And just a real fundamental example of who pays is the guy who's driving down J. Turner Butler and he sees a new development going in along there and he thinks, how the heck can new development be going in here when I am in gridlock traffic in the morning and afternoon? Look at that, how are they going in there? But of course his car is right there on the road, and he's there, he's contributing to the issue too. And then you look at, if you're looking from that developer's side out on J. Turner Butler, you think, hey, I'm going to be putting cars out there, but I shouldn't have to do that because I, pay property taxes and do this and do that, so I really shouldn't have to do that. So both sets of people don't think they should be paying anything for the right to drive on J. Turner Butler and do so without any traffic. Those are the perspectives that you have, and they're both strong and strongly felt, believe you me. So let's talk about funding of infrastructure in kind of the same way Robert did a little bit of a survey, and I'm going to also breeze through some of this before talking about some newer examples. But obviously, impact fees have been around for a long time. That's a very fundamental way to pay for infrastructure. Born I guess not too long ago, maybe that's a long time ago, 50 years or so ago, but they didn't really come into widespread use until the 1980s. If you've studied impact fees or you know about impact fees, you know that they're governed in Florida here by the dual rational nexus test, which is the simple way to describe that is the amount you pay has to have some rational nexus to your impacts, and once the government collects that money, how it spends the money has to have a rational nexus to the impacts that it's trying to address. So there's a rational nexus both on what's paid and what's spent. And impact fees obviously have community-wide application. They're a uniform amount that everybody pays no matter what a developer's circumstances are. There certainly are limitations on charges and expenditures, so it's a system that by now in case law it's fairly well defined as to what you can do and how you in collecting the money and how you can spend it. And certainly impact fees are still in use in many counties, not in Duval County, I should say, but certainly in St. Johns County and others. So a little branch off here, this is kind of like evolution or something, so you have these little branch offs that I'll talk about. Developments of regional impact, they've also been around since the 80s. Those are very large developments that have impacts on multiple jurisdictions. It's a state of Florida thing. And so typically they're large developments. Nocatee was certainly a DRI, and not this Deerwood, but the other Deerwood down on J. Turn Butler is a DRI. So there's a number of DRIs, but that was a very big thing, particularly between the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. Part of that regulatory system, which involves state and local governments, definitely involved exactions, sometimes large exactions. There was a state methodology for how to do that, so it wasn't just Wild West, no rules. There was a methodology. The recession had a big impact on DRIs because the exactions were in the tens or sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars for a development, and when the recession hit, nobody could pay it. And so a lot has happened to DRIs since the recession. There were reactions in the legislature both in 2009 and 2011, and as Robert alluded to, DRIs are definitely very, very, very few people do any new DRIs, and what DRIs really are about now are the ones that are already approved. What do you do with those vested rights? But when it was being used, it was a way for millions and millions of dollars to be exacted, obtained for infrastructure development. Northern St. Johns County, most of the roads you see there, they were all built by DRIs. They were not built by, local governments don't spend much on transportation infrastructure. That's particularly the case in St. Johns County. So a lot of those roads were built by DRIs that are still in place there. So a couple of years after I started practicing, 1985, Florida adopted the Growth Management Act and the concept of concurrency. Many of you may know it, but in a nutshell, if I'm developing a piece of property, I have to demonstrate that the facilities and services that are needed for that development are in place to accommodate my development. For traffic, a very complicated system was devised after the Growth Management Act to measure traffic concurrency. Roadways would be assessed for their capacity. Then they'd try to figure out how much a development was generating in terms of trips to use that capacity. So capacity became a limited resource. Development then became all about racing to get that very limited resource. And concurrency became a very complicated and pretty top-heavy regulatory mechanism. In the 1990s, they realized that concurrency, the way it worked, could shut down any use of some properties because there was no capacity, and there were some takings issues with that. So in the 1990s was born a proportionate share, or here in Duval County, a fair share system where developers would pay for their impacts, not through impact fees, that's different, but rather through a development agreement kind of mechanism, a project by project mechanism where the developer would pay for his impacts. And the focus was on how many trips he's generating and how much capacity he's using on that road, et cetera, et cetera. The problem with fair share and proportionate share agreements became that, first of all, the amount people would pay would be completely unpredictable. You could have a convenience store paying $100,000 and a half mile away, the same kind of convenience store might be paying $5 million. So there were wildly varying amounts that people were paying in relatively similar circumstances. Nobody liked the system. And the last bullet you see there, an unintended effect of focusing upon roadway capacity, you can probably envision it and you can see it, is out in the rural areas, there's plenty of capacity on those roads. Some of them you could lie down in the middle of the road in the middle of the day and you'd never get run over. Whereas in town, there was very little capacity because a lot of people live there and were driving there. So what did that do? It actually encouraged developers to go develop out in the suburbs where there was more capacity available, and it was easier for them to meet concurrency and do that. So in 2009 and then again in 2011, the legislature, I'm gonna actually, the legislature dealt with proportionate shares in a way that I'll get to in a second. This is another offshoot, like I said, an evolutionary offshoot. There is an example of a related kind of funding mechanism that's not far from here on J. Turner Butler, called a transportation management area, and that took concurrency a little bit of a step away and devised an area in which roadways were planned to run a certain way that everybody wanted them to run. There was a mix of uses that was planned to make sure that it wasn't all offices or all residential. And so that regulatory system came into effect in kind of the JTB 9A Bay Meadows area. And a lot of the roads out there that are there were built through that transportation management area, which was approved in 1998. It's an example of a kind of development agreement that arose when there was concurrency and proportionate share and other things. It's just kind of different, and it was an innovation here in Jacksonville. So as I mentioned before, when people got tired of proportionate share and fair share and the unpredictability of it and the fact that concurrency was pushing development out into the suburbs, in 2010 and 11, mobility fees came into favor. They're similar to impact fees, but a bit different. They certainly are applied community-wide. The state suggested some methodologies for mobility fees, and there certainly are limitations on how they can be spent. They can only be spent on infrastructure that addresses the impacts of those development. But particularly in the last two bullets that you see there, for mobility fees, first there was a focus on trip length, not so much how many trips a development was generating. So a development that was way out in the suburbs where people were driving 10 miles before they got to anything, that development had to pay more. Payments were punitive on that kind of development, as opposed to urban development where the payments are less for mobility fees. And mobility fees also are multimodal in that you can get credits if you have multimodal transportation, and the money has to go to other modes of transportation, not just roads and such. So mobility fees are actually now in place in Jacksonville, and other communities are starting to adopt them. Jacksonville was actually one of the first communities in the state to adopt mobility fees, so to that extent it was forward-looking. So I'm going to talk about these for a few minutes, because this is kind of new stuff, just like Robert was talking about sector planning. So there have been several developments, several counties and several developments that contemplated how to build infrastructure in a slightly different way. And what these counties wanted to do was achieve a couple of things. Number one, plan roads in advance, see what roads would be needed for development, and not only plan where they would be, but how they would be funded. So the planning of roadway infrastructure is important in each of these places. Also, they wanted to make sure the funding would be in place so that a bunch of development wouldn't happen without funding in place to pay for that infrastructure. They wanted to make sure it would get done, it would get built. But these communities also wanted to make sure that the exactions that developers would have to pay were not so exorbitant that economic development would be hampered. So let's take Nassau County as a specific example. Up there's an area between the Intercoastal and 95, and much of it is owned by Rayonier or TerraPoint, which has gone through some name changes. And that land is ripe for development, and Nassau County, at least if you're one of the people in charge there, Nassau County needs economic development, it needs jobs. So Nassau County wanted to plan for that area in a very thoughtful way, wanted to make sure the infrastructure would be put in, it would be funded, and it would be paid for and done in a smart way, but also wanted to be sure that the exactions that were levied on that landowner and those developers were not so much that economic development would stay away, but rather it would be incentivized to come there. So they wanted to make sure that their mobility fees were competitive, that they weren't wildly more than Duval County or St. Johns County. And one of the ways that Nassau County decided to keep those fees down was to use tax increment financing, or TIF, as a way to really subsidize those mobility fees and partially pay for those roadway improvements. If you're not familiar with tax increment financing, essentially when a development comes in, obviously, and things get built on a piece of property, the value of the property increases, and therefore the tax revenues, the ad valorem tax revenues from that piece of property increase. And so that being a byproduct of development, that tax increment being a byproduct of development, the argument is it's a logical pool of money to use to help pay for development, because without that development there wouldn't be that tax increment increase, and so therefore the development in that way pays for itself in part. So Nassau County did not want to take all of the tax increment that would be generated by that piece of property, but rather just a percentage of it. And Nassau County decided to say, okay, we're going to make developers pay a mobility fee like they do everywhere else, but we're also going to use the tax increment, the ad valorem taxes that are generated by that, or a small piece of them, to subsidize, to keep that mobility fee down. And the developers would come in and build the roads, but over time would be reimbursed by a pool of money which consists of mobility fees being paid and tax increment financing coming in. So in that way, the roads get built, they get funded, they're paid in part by the developer, but they're also subsidized in part by that increase in ad valorem taxes and the increased revenues from the development. They're subsidized, the development subsidizes itself by partially paying into that fund. So that mechanism is now in place up in that area in Nassau County, and it was more recently adopted on a large piece of property in northwestern St. Johns County that is planned for commercial development. It's called the Cummer Tract, and it's right near 95 and where 295 is going to come hooking in. And there's been talk of a Bass Pro Shop going there and other stuff. So that same mechanism, again, using planning of roadways, anticipating those roadways, making the developer pay through mobility fees, but using those mobility fees plus the ad valorem taxes that are generated by the development in part to pay for those roads that are going to be built and go in as development occurs. So as I said, that's been used in Nassau County and St. Johns County. It's also been used some in Duval County at the north end of the road. If you drive to the airport and you see all that development that's occurring right to the east of where you get off to the airport, so you know where River City, what's it called? River City, that's right, River City Marketplace, right, I had a mental blank. River City Marketplace, a lot of the roads in there have been paid for through this kind of funding, similar kind of funding, which I could go into, but that's probably too much detail. So this is a new way that goes hand in hand with the sector planning that Robert talked about, where development is paying for itself, developers are paying, but also the exactions are somewhat subsidized by the tax revenues that are generated by the development. So that's kind of the cutting edge of this question. I would say that looking back over that whole entire history, from impact fees up through now the mobility fees and some of these newer mechanisms, there have definitely been some lessons learned. One is unintended consequences. So concurrency and fair share had an unintended consequence of actually encouraging urban sprawl. The legislature recognized that in 2009 and 11. So unintended consequences is one thing. And then pricing. I mean, the eclipse of DRIs and now the use of TIF to kind of subsidize these mobility fees is an acknowledgement that exactions can get so much that it has a dampening effect on economic development and growth and job growth and other things. So these are two lessons learned. In a similar way, local governments now are much more accountable as to how they spend these monies. Jacksonville had a fair share system for many years and nobody knew how the monies were getting spent. But that is more, the city is much more accountable now under some of these newer mechanisms. So that is, I think, the last thing, and I'd be happy to answer any questions alongside Robert.
My question is, how are you going to develop in such a way that discourages people from driving cars and puts them on mass transit and bicycles and pedestrian? Both of you.
So I think I did hear that. Mass transit, bicycle, pedestrian, that kind of thing. I will say that in the mobility fee ordinance that the city of Jacksonville adopted in 2011, it was very much focused on, as I said, multimodal, such as mass transit, multimodal forms of transportation such as mass transit and bicycle and pedestrian. And an example of that is that 11% of any money that comes from mobility fees must be spent on those modes, not on new roads, but on those modes. So that is one example of the ways in which the newer kinds of exactions, that one being mobility fees, focuses on non-car, non-vehicle modes of transportation. There are other things we can go into, but that's an example I could give. I don't know whether
Okay, I'm going to take us all the way back to the beginning of this summit. And I was on board with you thinking about the TIFs until I realized when you said east of 95, we're talking about in 30 to 50 years, there could be serious impacts on that infrastructure from the global disruptions, sea change, all those things. And now my tax dollars, future tax dollars, a portion of which are going to fund development in these areas that may become of concern and may not outlive this century. Are you prepared for that conversation? You're talking about people that come to the zoning meetings and the hearings and everything. That very much is going to start impacting those types of conversations and hearings as we move into the next decade. How are you looking ahead to that when you're using public dollars, both your own as a developer is being used, your clients, but also public dollars in areas that may not survive 100 years?
So a couple of things. The area in Nassau that I was talking about goes up to 95. It's certainly west of the intercoastal, far west of the beach. It's not in any of the zones where they're concerned about, for example, you know, hurricane impacts and such. So I would say that it's a little farther west from the beach than, say, where I grew up in Fort Lauderdale, where 95 was pretty close to the beach. So it's pretty far west, and none of those discussions came up in terms of climate change or anything like that. Also, tax increment financing doesn't use your tax dollars unless you live there, unless you decide to live there. So the tax dollars that come from that area are the ones that are used to build a portion of them. It's actually only, I think it was 12%. A portion of them are used to fund that roadway infrastructure. So it's not your tax dollars if you live out on Fernandina. It would only be your tax dollars if you live right there in that area. And the last thing I would say is hurricane preparedness and that kind of and those kinds of issues do come up a lot, and Florida regulates that. Climate change does not. I mean, I'm just stating that as a fact, not that it's good or bad. I'm just stating it as a fact. So, so that did not come up in the conversations. But that particular property is pretty far west, and again, the TIF dollars were generated right there, not over on the beach or further west or anything like that.
Other questions? No other questions?
As to where the TIF dollars are being used, what is the rationale that was used when it's a diversion of tax dollars? It's tax dollars that would be generated that could be used on police, fire, rescue, all other types of things. What was the rationale used in the discussions to create this TIF-type financing for the diversion of those dollars?
That's a very logical question, and that did come up. So it's reasonable and logical for you to ask that question. So what Nassau County did in that instance, and different counties do it different ways, is it said, okay, we want this area to grow economically. Further west of 95 in Nassau County, you know, might grow, but it's probably a few years down the road. And east of the intercoastal, they don't really want any, I mean, if you ask people, they don't really want any more growth there. So this area is the area of Nassau County where there can be growth. And what the county decided was, okay, by taking that 12% number from the ad valorums, that leaves us enough, because they they calculated what percentage of the ad valorem goes to police and fire and some of those other things. By taking 12% of those ad valorem, they were taking money that was going to be otherwise spent on roadway infrastructure, and they decided to agree that it should be spent there, right within that area. Now, arguably, does that deprive money generated there from going to Fernandina or Amelia Island or to West? Yeah, it does. And to that extent, those people might logically have a complaint about it. But it was a decision on the county's part to say, okay, we're going to incentivize this area to grow, to have some economic development, and so we're going to take that 12% and apply it to traffic infrastructure there.
Sorry to both of you, and TR, I'm sort of reflecting back on parallel careers here, and I'm thinking about all the ways these things have changed. What's your thought about what's going to happen in the future in terms of changes to funding patterns and stimulation for growth where we need it and don't need it?
Well, that's interesting. I think I would say two things off the top of my head. One is it was really, really interesting to see how the recession affected everybody's attitude, and not just, oh gosh, because of the recession we need to encourage jobs and therefore we need to relax on regulation. I mean, that's kind of the first thought that people have, but literally the fact that there were, as of 2009 and 10, many DRIs out there with hundreds of millions of dollars of exactions that would be required, and nobody could do them. So people just started abandoning DRIs, and there is a process for that, but nobody had really done it before 2009 or so. People just started abandoning DRIs and then selling off parcels within those planned communities, and the plans were scuttled, and then parcels just started being sold off and developed in smaller pieces, and that's not good from anybody's perspective. So the recession really got people thinking about, okay, so massive exactions may not be the way to do this. Let's think of some other ways. So that's one interesting thing. So I think we'll have more of that in the future. And I think also that a more open and transparent system for coming up with some of these. I don't work in Tallahassee. I don't do much work there, but it's always seemed to me that we just kind of accept whatever they hand us in terms of regulations or something, And so I think that local governments and maybe state government are going to be a little more transparent in how they adopt some of these things, whether it's mobility fees or the kinds of sector plans that Robert was talking about. I think that there will be, and has been more recently, more transparency. I mean, I'll say in Jacksonville that there are more meetings up front now than there ever were or have been in the past. When I say meetings up front, I mean community meetings, workshops where citizens are invited to come in and talk about plans. There's more of that going on now than there has been in the past. That's all positive. I think it diffuses these kinds of community disputes that you can get into. So those are two trends, just kind of some more economic reality and how the economy affects regulation and things like this, an awareness of that, and then more openness and transparency in terms of how these things are, regulations and regulatory systems are put into place, I think. Two phenomena.
On the other side of funding, we talked about funding of infrastructure, funding of development. There's also funding of preservation. And we have to think in Tallahassee, there's been several different ideas of how to fund preservation. Historically, it's been the state buying large chunks of land to hold for preservation. But I think in the future, we might have a trend towards the public sector, the state, the local governments, incentivizing developers to develop in a way where they use less of their land for development and more for preservation, but with incentives from the state, rather than saying, we will come take the preservation land and protect that, and you develop your land 100%. They'll work with developers to encourage growth in a way that each individual development, each individual plan incorporates a large preservation component.